Hi, Assalamualaikum and greetings to all. So now what we're going to do is we're going to look at an overview revision of whatever that you have learned from week 1 until week 13 throughout this semester. So basically we are going to look at what is the most important thing in our course. So before we start, let's have a look at this one. So basically, ladies and gentlemen, when you talk about translating language and culture, negotiations and representations, which is the title of our course, we are actually looking at meaning. So if you look very carefully here, meaning is in the center of our discussion. So when you talk about meaning, you will discover translations, and last but not least, you will also discover cultural identity. So before we start, let's have a look at this in terms of the overview. So if you look at the colors here that I have actually put in order to facilitate your understanding, these colors here, they carry different meaning in terms of the critical concepts. So let's begin. So first and foremost, we actually talk about representations. So basically, if you talk about representations, it is about images, ideas that are used to illustrate your experience, people, objects or events, and whatever that you see or experience, they convey or carry specific meaning, and this meaning basically they are cultural bias. So if you look very carefully here, so representations, they are images, ideas that are used to illustrate experience in terms of people. You meet people every day, in the past, now and in the future, and you talk about the objects or behaviors or events in the past, and whatever that you have actually found or encountered, they are carrying meaning. Very importantly, they carry meaning, and this meaning culturally biased. So very important. And when you talk about representations, there are two types of representations. The first one is what we call mental representations. So basically, mental representations, they are events, actions, images from the past that explain or relate to the current situations. And this can come in terms of smell, visual, or touch, or movement. So basically, all this will bring back memories. So for example, if you actually go to a cafe and you smell nasi lemak, suddenly you will remember your mother's nasi lemak. So those are smell in terms of mental representation. So that's the first type. The second type is what we call language as a system of representations. Now this is very, very important because you use a language in order to explain meaning. It doesn't matter what language that you want to use, as long as the meaning that you want to share with other people, they are explained, and the method that you explain is by using a language. So that's two types of representations, mental representations as well as language as a system of representation. The next one that you need to know about representation is approaches to representation. So basically, we have three approaches to representations. The first one is reflective, as is, and then we have intentional. Intentional means it depends on the intentions of yourself, the doer. And then the next one is what we call constructivist. Now, constructivist depends on experience and expectation of other people. So when you want to explain representations, you will be using either reflective or intentional. That means your own meaning that you want to share, your own intention. And then constructivist, other people actually construct their own meaning based on what you see or based on what they see, very importantly. And because you talk about constructivists, there will be various meanings that will come out of one particular object or incident or event or behavior. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's about representation. So what you need to know, the definition of representations, it's about meaning, and then we have the types of representation, and then we have approaches to representation. Moving on, we are going to look at negotiations. Now, ladies and gentlemen, negotiations are also about meaning. How so? When you talk about negotiations, you are discussing something in order to achieve something. You are getting solutions through exchange of meaning. Now, this is where meaning comes into play, because when you negotiate, you try to achieve a common goal. So you try to achieve the same meaning. And because of that, there will be processes of give and take. You lose something, you gain something. So basically, negotiations is the process where you discuss, where you give and take, where you get solutions through exchange of meaning. And be prepared to lose, and of course, you will gain something. And when you talk about negotiations, we discuss, ladies and gentlemen, 5 important strategies. Negotiation strategies. So basically, we have the first one is accommodating. Now, accommodating is where you actually lose a little bit in order to maintain good relationships with the other party. So you let the other party win a little bit more than yourself. So remember, accommodating, you lose a little bit and you let the other party win a little bit more. Now, the reason for this is because you want to have further collaborations or further business. You want to maintain good relationships with the other party. The second strategy is avoiding. So basically, both of you and the other party enter into this negotiation process, and then suddenly both parties realize that you will not benefit from this negotiation process. So you avoid altogether. So it's lose and lose. The third one is collaborating. Now, many people like to have a win-win situation. That means you get something, the other party gets something, the other party loses something, you also lose something. So basically, it's a balanced situation. So collaborating, win-win situation. The next one, the opposite of accommodating, is competing. Now, competing is where you win a little bit more and the other party loses a little bit. Now, in this strategy, you do not want to maintain good relationship with the other party, but the other party wants to maintain a good relation with you. So it's the opposite of number 1, accommodating. And last but not least is compromising. Now, compromising is where you actually split the difference. Let's say you are doing business with one party, and then the profit is 101 apples. So 50 apples go to you, 50 apples go to the other party. So there's 1 apple left. So what do you want to do with this apple? So there are a few things that you can do. The first one, you can eat together half and half the apple, or you can sell the apple, let's say for 1 ringgit. So 50% goes to you, or 50 cents goes to you and 50 cents goes to the other party. So you split the difference basically. So ladies and gentlemen, there are 5 negotiation strategies: accommodating, lose-win; avoiding, lose-lose; collaborating win-win, competing win-lose, and last but not least, compromising split the difference. Now let's go back to the middle of our revision note here. So we have talked about representations, we have talked about negotiations. Now the biggest part of our lessons throughout the semester, we talk about translation. So let's have a look at translation. What does it mean by translation? We learn a lot in terms of translations, the theories, approaches, and then we also have the strategy, and of course we have a sub-aspect of translation. So first and foremost, what is a translation practice? So basically, translations, it's about conveying meaning from one language into the other. So when you talk about translation, you must have at least two languages. So it can be from Bahasa Melayu to English, or it can be from English to Mandarin. So it depends. But you must have two different languages. So that's translation. So you convey meaning. So when you do translation, regardless of the approaches, the strategies, the theories that you want to use, the meaning must remain the same, very importantly. And if you talk about translation in general, there are two issues. There are two issues when you talk about translation in general. The first one is grammar by these two issues. So of course, when you have two different languages, there will be two systems of grammar. So that can be a huge issue for some translators. And the second one is, of course, vocabulary. Vocabulary, sometimes in one language, you do not have equivalent meaning or word in the other language. So that can pose a huge issue to translators. So translations, ladies and gentlemen, in general, there are two issues, grammar and vocabulary. Now let's have a look at what we call theories of translation. So basically, when you talk about theories, you talk about two theories that we know of. The first one is scopus. Now, when you talk about scopus as a theory of translation, you must talk about the origin and why and what kind of text that would be beneficial to be translated using scopus. So basically, when you talk about scopus as a theory of translation, you must explain the origin. It is from Germany, and it's basically used for linguistically biased texts. For example, manuals or speeches, and it focuses on aims of doing translation. Why must you do the translation? So basically, scopus is the first theory of translation. The second theory of translation is what we call polysystems. Now, polysystem originated from Russia, a Russian base, and it is best used to translate literary biased texts, for example, novels, poems, short stories. And it focuses basically on the importance of language and culture. So very importantly, these two different theories, scopus and polysystems. And when you talk about theory, why must you have a theory when you talk about translation? Now, a theory acts as a framework in order for you to understand issues and, of course, to make decisions. So when you want to do translation, you must have a framework. So which one that you want to use? What's the purpose, or what is it that you want to translate? So all this will actually give you some ideas of what theories that you want to use. Now, after looking at the theories, ladies and gentlemen, we have what we call approaches to translation. Now, approaches to translation, we have actually, what we have here in the green colored background is the conventional approaches to translation. We have 5. Okay, 5. And these 5 approaches, they come under the 2 theories that I have explained earlier. So number 1, the first approach, Scopus. So Scopus is under Scopus theory. It focuses on aims and purposes of doing translation. So basically, when you want to do translation, you must know who is the target audience. For example, what is the purpose of this translation? So you can use Scopus as an approach to translation. And then we have the second one, equivalence. Now, equivalence is where you do word-for-word translation, and this is under polysystem theory. The next one is what we call descriptive translation studies, and this is where you describe, you summarize the main points, and this is under polysystems theory. And then we have eco-translatology as an approach to translation. This is where you base your translation on your surroundings, on perceptions. So basically, you will have to select and you will have to adapt. And this is under polysystem theory. Last but not least is what we call cultural translation. Now, this is where the culture of the target language becomes the most important component when you want to do translation. And this is under polysystem theory. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as I said just now, these 5 approaches, they are what we call conventional approaches. However, today, we also have contemporary approaches to translation, including linguistic approach, semiotic approach, socio-linguistic approach, and there are 3 others. So basically, when you want to do translation, you have to actually look at the purpose. You really have to look at the reasons why, and then of course the suitability of the text that you want to translate. You can choose either conventional approaches, these 5 approaches, or you can use contemporary approaches, 6 approaches of contemporary approaches to translation. Next, let's have a look at what we call strategies of translation. So all these, they come under translation. So translation, we have the theories. Translation, we have the approaches. And now let's have a look at the strategies. Basically, we have 2 strategies to translation. The first one is foreignization. And this is where the translator wants to uphold the culture of the source language or text. So basically, you have the source language or the original language, and then of course you have the other language that you want to translate. So foreignization is the strategy used by a translator who wants to uphold, to maintain the culture of the original text. In comparison to domestication, domestication is where the strategy used by a translator who is interested in keeping the values and culture of the target language. So foreignization, uphold the original language. Domestication is you want to keep the values or introduce the culture of the target language. So 2 strategies of translation. So ladies and gentlemen, let's do a little bit of recaps. We have 2 theories of translation, Scopus and polysystems. We have 5 approaches, conventional approaches to translation. This is the smaller framework. We have Scopus, equivalence, descriptive, eco-translatology, and cultural translation. And we have two strategies of translation: foreignization and domestication. Now, let's have a look at another subcategories or aspect or components of translation. So basically, this is what we call subcategories. There are three basically subcategories. The first one is what we call or know as poetry translation. So what does it mean by poetry translation? Poetry translation is where you actually relay or convey poetry into another language according to sound-based, syntactic, structural, or pragmatic. So poetry translation is basically you have one poem in one language and then you want to translate into another language. And poetry is very special simply because there's rhymes. So it's like when you are singing. So that's why it's sound-based, syntactic, structural, as well as pragmatic. And there are two trends. There are two main trends when you talk about poetry translation. The first one is cross-cultural practices. This is where you actually cross from one culture to the other when you do the poetry translation. And then the second trend is online translation. This is where you actually use the internet in order to help you do the translation. The only problem with online translation is the fact that it lacks emotional as well as people touch. So you will not find the emotion in the poetry translation. Let's say you are translating from Bahasa Melayu to English. So the Bahasa Melayu poem is like a very sad poem. So if you use online translation, perhaps you may not have the feel or the emotions that human translator can do in comparison to online translation. So that's two trends: cross-cultural practices and online translation. So basically these are the two main ones. Of course, there are others. And of course, there are two main issues as well when you talk about poetry translation. The first one is culturally biased. Now, of course, when you do poetry translation, it's all full with cultural practices. So you will have sometimes in the target language, there's no such thing as that cultural practice which is being relayed in the poem. So you will have a hard time in order to translate because the practice in the target culture is non-existent. So the first issue is culturally biased, and the second one, sometimes translators have problems which theories or which approaches to use when they want to do poetry translation. So basically two main issues, and again similar to trends, of course there are other issues, but we are highlighting just two for this particular revision. Now the second subcategory of translation is what we call first to second language translation. So this is where you use your first language and then you translate into your second language. For example, for myself, my first language is Bahasa Melayu and my second language is English. So I am translating from Bahasa Melayu to English. So basically, first to second language translation, there's only one trend. And this one trend is what we call transadaptation. Transadaptation is where both language as well as culture play a very important role for this translation process. So it's not only the language that you translate, but the culture. And this can be a huge task, and it can be very difficult for young translators. So ladies and gentlemen, the second subcategory for translation, first to second language translation, there's one trend which is transadaptation. So this is where both language and culture are very important in the translation process. The last subcategory is what we call second to third language translation. Now, second to third language translation, basically, for myself, my second language is English and my third language is Arabic, for example. So I am doing translation from English to Arabic. And there are two issues basically when you talk about second to third language translation. The first one is grammar and vocabulary mismatch, of course, because your second language is not your first language. So because of that, it's not your second culture. Your second culture is not your first culture. So you may have issues. And what more to translate to a third language and to a third culture. So that can be quite hard. And the second issue is cultural differences that can be, again, confusing. Because for myself, my first language, my first culture, Bahasa Melayu and Malay culture. And then the second culture, English. And because I am not a native of English or England or American, so that would pose a huge problem when you talk about these cultural differences. So when you do translation, all this will play into the factors, how you actually do the translation. And ladies and gentlemen, from various resources, it has been suggested that it is easier to translate from second to first language rather than from first to second language. This is because maybe you are more familiar with your own language, with your own culture. So the second language and second culture is easier to be translated into the first language. However, of course, different translators have different experience, have different ideas. So this may not be true to everybody. And there's one more thing that you need to know when you talk about language transfer. Now, language transfer is basically happening during second to third language translation. Language transfer is when you use your knowledge of your first language in order to do translation into the second language. So that is language transfer. So ladies and gentlemen, that's on translation only. So translation. So basically, we have theories, we have approaches. This one is conventional approaches. We have strategies of translation, and then we have subcategories. Poetry translation, first to second language translation, and second to third language translation. The last part of this revision is cultural identity. So what does it mean by cultural identity? Now, cultural identity is the identity or sense of belonging, your sense of belonging. It is a self-conception and self-perception, and it is about making meaning of your existence. So why are you here? So what's the meaning of your existence? So that is cultural identity. It's about making meaning. And some ideas on this cultural identity is one critical concept or term that all of you must know, which is cultural identifiers. Now, cultural identifiers are aspects or elements used to attach some to a group of people, such as gender, nationality, age, food, and many others. Now, when you talk about cultural identifiers, a person can have more than one cultural identifier. For example, myself, Let's say I like nasi lemak. So that's one group of cultural identifier in terms of food. And then I am from Negeri Sembilan. So what happened is that I have a cultural identifier in terms of locality, which is Negeri Sembilan. So do not confuse cultural identifiers and cultural identity. So cultural identity is basically about your sense of belonging, yourself, making meaning of yourself. And cultural identifiers, they are about grouping or element used to attach some people to a group of people, such as gender, locality, age, and many others. So ladies and gentlemen, if you look very carefully here at our meaning, we look at representations, we look at negotiations, we look at translation, and we look at cultural identity. They are all about making meaning. And how does all of this, let's say negotiation, how does negotiation, or how does representation, how does translation or cultural identity, so how do all this relate to political practices, or relate to social development, or relate to economic development? Of course, they are true meaning. So for example, if you talk about political practices, when politicians talk about something, they are making meaning. They are trying to convey their message. So their message contains meaning. Vote for me, for example. And when you talk about economic development, when you talk about, for example, writing some sort of promotional item, or when you are writing the menu